What you're about to see are the events that led to the Lauder fire burnover on September 29, 1987. There was 1 fatality and 4 serious burns. The Lauder fire was located in the Coast Range Mountains of northwestern California. The fire started early in the morning on September 29th. Originally, it was assumed that this was smoke from another fire in the area. Several citizen reports of smoke in the area had been called in to the Howard Forest Dispatch Center, but it wasn't until a report of flames cited that a fire captain was dispatched in a pickup truck to check the area. At 5:19 a.m., he confirmed a new fire start and assumed the role of incident commander. 4 engines and a dozer were dispatched to the fire. The initial size-up reported the fire at about 10 acres, burning on a 60 to 70% slope that was dissected by drainages. The fire was burning on an east-facing aspect. Fire behavior was a surface fire, with occasional flare-ups, making short runs at the head of the fire. The fuels in the area consisted of a heavy brush understory, made up of 40-year-old ceanothus and manzanita, along with a Douglas fir, oak, and madrone overstory. The canopy closure was 85 to 95%, and there were many snags in the area. These large snags were a problem in fire line location and in holding the fire line. The 10-hour fuel moisture was estimated at 7%. As resources started to arrive, the IC divided the fire into 2 divisions, one on each flank of the fire. The plan was to hold the fire at the ridge with helicopters and air tankers and control the flanks with hose lays, dozers, and hand crews. U.S. Forest Service resources would be assigned to work the left or south flank of the fire, and California Department of Forestry resources would be assigned to work the right or north flank. Helicopter 101 was the local initial attack helicopter for the area, based at Howard Forest Helibase, 20 miles southwest of the fire. It was down for maintenance, and a call-when-needed ship, Helicopter 94, was being used in its place, with the normal Helitack crew, 101, assigned to it. A second ship, Helicopter 102, happened to be stationed at Howard Forest Helibase that morning due to a fire assignment the day before. Dispatch assigned both helicopters with their Helitack crews to the new fire. It was decided that the 2 helicopters would fly to the new incident together and work as a team. Initially, Helicopter 94 wouldn't start, so Helicopter 102 took off and flew to the fire alone. Helicopter 102 arrived over the fire at 7:20 a.m. At this time, there were already several other resources on scene. The crew captain on Helicopter 102 did not feel comfortable landing on the ridge above the fire, so he decided to set down at the bottom of the fire. Crew 102, consisting of a first-year Helitack captain and 4 firefighters, unloaded and tooled up with McLeods only, leaving the chainsaw in the ship. Helicopter 102 then took off and started to make water drops on the fire. Crew 102 walked up the right flank of the fire, where they tied in with 3 engines and a dozer that were working that flank. One of the engine officers had assumed the role of division supervisor. When Crew 102 met up with the division supervisor, he assigned them to work with the hose lay on the right flank. They were told to build hand line, stay together, and not get too far ahead of the hose lay. The captain of Crew 102 told the division supervisor that he did not feel this was a good use of his crew, but they would begin work on the hand line. The crew started to put in a minimal hand line through the heavy brush in front of the hose lay. Here you see some of their hand line. Crew 102 had been at work less than an hour when the division supervisor noticed their hand line was not holding very well. He advised them not to get too far ahead of the hose lay, or they may be cut off by fire activity below them. Helicopter 94 arrived at approximately 7:25 a.m. Helicopter 94 flew over the fire, and they decided to land on top of the ridge. The landing site was marginal, requiring a 1-skid landing. The captain of Crew 101 made the determination that his crew could hold the ridge with the support of helicopter water drops and air tankers. At this time, Crew 101, consisting of a veteran helitack captain and 5 firefighters, unloaded from Helicopter 94 on the ridge above the fire and started to build line. For the next hour and a half they worked the ridge with air support, and their strategy seemed to be working. At 8:40 a.m., a battalion chief arrived on the scene to take over as the incident commander. At this time, there were 2 Forest Service engines working the left flank, 3 CDF engines, a dozer, and Crew 102 working the right flank, as well as helicopters and air tankers working the top of the fire. As the sun started to rise and hit the crest of the ridge, numerous spot fires began developing on the ridgetop. Sometime shortly after 9 a.m., the captain of Crew 101 asked Air Attack where Crew 102 was working. He was told by the Air Attack that they were at the bottom of the fire working on the right flank. Because of the terrain and independent use of radio frequencies, Crew 101 could not make direct radio contact with most of the other resources on the fire.
Probably an hour later, or maybe even a little longer, as this fire kept progressing, widening up here and giving us trouble, I had sent my middle 2 guys, built a helo spot up here, and we were going to bring in 2 inmate crews. I had made contact with the IC then. In the meantime, before, or just as we finished the helo spot, the fire overran that, and it was just a little ways south of us here.
Okay.
So rather than bring inmates into that precarious spot, that's when I decided, well, why don't you send 102 up here? And I asked Rick. See, I was on the back side of this ridge. I couldn't talk to anybody on the ground on the east side. With this real hogback ridge, car-to-car traffic just did not work. So I was talking, everything that I communicated with was through the Air Attack. And he agreed with that plan and made contact.
Rick was in the Air Attack?
Yes, Rick Patterson.
Patterson, okay.
And he was just freshly out of helitack, a real knowledgeable man and a good set of eyes up there. But that was one of the problems here, you'll find out later. Nobody could see anybody on the ground. So he made contact with 102 and with the IC and the people on the right flank. And he said, how do you want them to get up there? And I said, I want them to go down the bottom and fly up. And that's the last I heard for a while. And then I checked in a little while.
Crew 102 received the request for assistance from Air Attack. The captain of Crew 102 had previously decided during the flight in that landing on top of the ridge was not a good idea. He felt his only alternative to respond to Crew 101's request was to hike up from the bottom. At this time, they borrowed a chainsaw from one of the engine crews working the hose lay behind them. At about 10 a.m., Crew 102 started working their way up the right flank to the ridge. After the decision was made to go up to the ridge, a veteran helitack crew member on Crew 102 questioned the safety of this action and stated that he thought it would be better to go back down. The slope was very steep and the brush so heavy that the crew had to cut an access line to get up the hill.
And then I checked in a little while later and he said, well, he'd made contact and they wanted to walk up. And I said, well, I prefer that they fly up, because I had looked here several times. Every time I got a breather, I came up this ridge or this one rock where we're actually standing. And I looked down there, and at one of those times I saw and heard him, well, a few times I heard him call for a water drop on a large snag. And Nick said on 102, where are you? And he said, I'm 3/4 of the way up the ridge. And Nick was looking around right underneath me, and he found, no, you're above me. So we went back down, and it turned out he was about 1/3 of the way up the ridge. And I saw the snag he dropped on, and I realized then that if they're going to walk up this thing, they're going to be beat, and I didn't want.
By 10 a.m., the sun had risen enough to hit the top of the ridge, but the lower part of the slope and the bottom of the fire where Crew 102 had been working was still in the shade. As the sun continued to rise, it began to shine on the lower slope, heating the fuels and the air in the bottom of the canyon. Up until this point, the fire had been burning upslope against the normal nighttime downslope wind. Soon after the slope became fully exposed to the sunlight, the wind began to transition from a nighttime downslope wind to a daytime upslope wind. The fire behavior increased. The flame lengths that were less than 2 feet at 8 a.m. quickly grew to 20 feet, and the fire began making significant upslope runs. At 9:45 a.m., weather observations were taken by the other division supervisor on the left flank of the fire. Temperature, 86 degrees. Relative humidity, 8 to 10%. Wind, south to southeast, 3 to 5 miles per hour. No cloud cover. The official report disagreed with these observations. The investigation team recreated the weather conditions for that morning using observations made later that day and the following day, estimating that the relative humidity was 20%. As Crew 102 was working up the hill, the right flank of the fire became very active. The pilot of Helicopter 102 noticed the fire had become well established in the brush below the crew. He contacted Crew 102 on the radio with this warning: "Please be aware, the fire below you is building up." The captain of Crew 102 acknowledged this message, but seemed unconcerned. The crew also noticed the fire activity, and one firefighter was directed to go down the fire line and observe the conditions. He quickly reported back that their escape route down the fire line was cut off. The division supervisor at the bottom of the fire had previously noticed the increased fire behavior and attempted to call Crew 102, the IC, and the air attack numerous times, with no success. The air attack, heli-attack crews, and helicopters on the fire were working on their special radio frequency, which the division supervisor did not have in his radio. After Crew 102 realized that their escape route was cut off, they tried to find another route away from the edge of the fire, but due to the heavy brush and a large ravine to the north, that proved impossible. They decided their only escape at this time would be to get into the burn. The crew then dropped their tools and ran into the black. This occurred at approximately 10:15 a.m. Here you see one of their discarded McLeod tools. At 10:20, a radio message from the crew indicated they were in trouble. They found an area where it wasn't as steep, a small bench with about a 30% slope. This is where they deployed their fire shelters. The white flagging indicates the location of their fire shelters. The site was extremely hot due to the residual burning of heavy fuels and superheated air funneling up a steep drainage below the bench.
So you deployed your shelters. So why don't you talk about that experience?
Well, it was, we pulled the shelters out. The ground was extremely hot. There were live coals all over the place, and it wasn't a typical shelter deployment that you see in the training movies. It was kind of roll up in a ball and flop back and forth until the air operations got some water in on us.
Was it you were rolling back and forth because of the heat of the ground?
Because of the heat.
So one part would get hot.
Right, you just flip over onto another side until that got hot.
What, were you all together?
We were within probably a 15-foot, 20-foot radius.
When you first deployed your shelter, what was Dennis Lee Collins doing?
Dennis was screaming. And he was screaming for someone to kill him. And that was probably the hardest thing to lay there and listen to. I physically just did not have the energy to get up and do anything for him.
How long did that go on?
About 5 minutes.
And then did he stop screaming altogether, or did you hear anything else?
Yeah, it just gradually got lower, and he finally stopped.
It took about 45 minutes for the first rescue personnel to reach the victims. Some of those rescuers were from Crew 101. They had to come down from the ridge above through unburned fuels to reach the site. The firefighter who was screaming earlier was found deceased. He had deployed his shelter next to a large burning log. You can see that log in the center of this aerial view. He was burned over 95% of his body, most of which were third-degree burns. The other 4 firefighters had burns covering 15 to 45% of their body, again mostly third-degree burns. 4 of the shelters showed very little heat damage. They functioned as designed. The deceased firefighter's shelter was exposed to temperatures between 700 and 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. It had received direct flame contact, where the others received only radiant heat. This was an intense, fast-moving fire, as shown by the complete consumption of fuels in the area. You have just seen the events that occurred on the Lauder fire. The instructor will now facilitate a discussion about the use of fire safety guidelines by the involved personnel, the strategic and tactical decisions that were made, and the human factors that contributed to this burnover incident.